So we're going to have a panel discussion now, and Brian can carry on with the conversation. So we're going to have Brian Hoskins, John Bush, Ali Wing, Inez Fung, and Kerry Emanuel. If you would come down and come to the front. And Rob van der Hilst, who's the chair of our department, is going to run this. It'll be fairly short.
I can do it from this mic, that is okay. We are only 25 minutes behind schedule. And we had planned kind of a 30 minutes or so Q&A. So let's cut through the chase. And I would like to invite people to, have questions for the panelists. And if you come forward with questions, please come to the microphone. Please introduce yourself first. And in the interest of time, I would like to ask you to be brief in the questions and also brief in the answers. And we will do this until about 5:40, and then I will, do the formal closing, and then we can actually proceed. I should mention that at 6 o'clock, there is actually a special peer hour in the Ida Green Lounge in our building, the Green Building. So everybody, of course, is invited to come there, and around 6:30, there is actually a recital. It's a violin piano recital. Because everybody loves music, and certainly Charney and Lorenz did. So I invite you all to come there. But first, who would like to kick off with questions to any of our panelists? Please.
We often spend all our time talking about predictability with chaos, but there are a lot of other implications of chaotic systems, especially for climate. So I wondered if you would have any opinions about how chaos and climate might be operating together in the future.
I'll only say very briefly, by way of addressing your question, that Ed was actually very fascinated, as you probably know, with that question, and he was interested in this question of intransitivity, more sort of perhaps relevant to short-term climate, or so we thought at the time. But John, you should be on the panel, because this is a great question for you. John Marshall has done some very interesting simulations about the, more than the traditional two multiple stable equilibria of the Earth's climate. And I think Ed found that very interesting. And can you forecast in the long range when you might go through one of these tipping points into a different equilibrium state?
Of course, people thought that there might be some tipping points in the present climate, that we might force the system so much that we flip into some other state, which of course is motivated by Lorenz's ideas. And there was that dreadful film that came out. I thought the love story was not very good in it. The Day After Tomorrow, you remember that film? And I think most people feel that the likelihood that we will flip into a new state is rather unlikely. If you're in a glacial climate with ice around, then maybe there are more feedbacks. If you're in a warm climate, maybe there aren't, but there so many feedbacks. But who knows? I think we just have to accept that that's a possibility. That a tipping might be a possibility.
Alan and Eugenia. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Alan Roebuck. I was Ed Lorenz's student. In one of my favorite podcasts, Big Picture Science, which I recommend to everybody, they had a discussion of the Nobel Prizes this past fall, and there was a question of the expert, is there anybody who should have gotten a Nobel Prize that didn't? He said, yes, I can easily think of one person, Ed Lorenz. He should have gotten one in physics for his work on chaos. And I was just wondering if there was any nomination or attempt to get him a Nobel Prize, because I really thought that was a great suggestion. It was the only person that this person that even suggested was really should have gotten one.
The answer is yes.
Yeah, I mean,
Yes,
Tim,
there was. Yeah, there
Tim
were.
addressed that point in his talk
Yeah,
today.
the answer is yes.
Short answer.
I wanted to go back to the previous question. If we consider the atmosphere and the ocean and the Earth system the way we are considering, it's difficult to think of jumping to another climate state. But right now we are in the Anthropocene, and the human system dominates what happens in the Earth system. And we have had many cases in the past of collapses because the human system, the population went over the carrying capacity, and those collapses lasted centuries. So my question is, shouldn't we have coupled human and Earth systems with feedbacks, like when we try to predict El Niño, we cannot predict El Niño without having feedbacks between the atmosphere and the ocean system, but we are not having a completely coupled system with feedbacks between the human and the natural system.
Can I have a go at this question, having not spoken earlier? But I think there's one thing when you're looking for this major catastrophe, but I think in climate we may be looking at more local catastrophes in terms of our expectation that the climate stays roughly as it is. And if you live in southern Australia and the storm track no longer quite hits it in winter, that is a major catastrophe, whereas in terms of the whole climate system, it's not. And the European climate, amazingly warm downstream of the Rockies, etc., right wavelength for the long waves. It doesn't require much imagination to see that changing as the average flow changes and the amount of blocking changes. So they may not, in terms of the whole climate system, be huge catastrophes as such, but for the human beings living there, they could well be.
Hi, my name is Madeline Youngson. I'm a graduate student in this department. My question is, what role do analytical models have in the future of climate science?
Everything. How can you?
Well, recently, the simple analytical models, or the, developing two-layer QG theory, and with numerical models, it seems like people have been moving away from that type of analysis.
You have to build intuition somehow. And I'll speak for myself that I can crank out a big model, I can give a color plot, and I can tell a story, but that doesn't mean that I have understood why I get the result I get, unless I have done the simple analytic equations, the solutions, and have a sense of order of magnitudes and other things. That I really am not a fan of big models, even though I use them. Because the intuition, sometimes they give me surprises, which is fantastic. But I think the intuition building has to come from simple analytical solutions and simple models that you can take apart and put it back together and do it and put it together in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, I can add, I think the design of experiments with complicated models depends on the formulation and a knowledge of what the problem is. And that knowledge comes from viewing it in a simpler context. And the more complex a model becomes, the more complex the diagnostic process must be as well. So one's ability to diagnose. So if I had my money, I'd say for every £1 you spend developing the complex model, you should spend 10 on the diagnostic framework.
Yeah, just to add that, I mean, I agree that I think we need a combination of, analytic models, simple theory, supported by analysis, observations, and these complicated models. And something that I definitely felt was really instilled in me in my education at MIT was the value of simple models. And then when we did use complex models, to use them as a tool for exploring mechanisms and processes and to try to explain something from basic physical perspectives. So I think that is needed for us to kind of make progress in some of these big fundamental questions.
This may follow on from this last question, but increasingly we hear about big data, artificial intelligence. I'm tempted to add the word mindless, but maybe I shouldn't bias the comments from you. So I'm interested in your comments about the use of artificial intelligence and big data and these massive processing exercises, which are growing in number.
I think for me, the limits to everything. So for analytic system, at least I can't think about nonlinear systems in my head. So then so we look at the nonlinear system and these simulations, and then the big data, the machine learning can show me something that I had not expected, right? This is where the 3D, the nonlinear models are very useful to tell me what I had not thought about. Right, because it's in the nonlinearity, my brain is fairly linear, and I don't function very well in that nonlinear space. So that the nonlinear models that will show me something that, gee, I've not thought about that. Is that correct? Is that a coding error? Is that physics? Or why do I get something that I had not expected? So that's if I go into a model with my predetermined set of metrics, I'm looking for something, and I'm looking under the light, and I hope that the artificial intelligence will tell me where I don't know where to look.
And I would add to that as models become more and more complex, our capacity just to detect patterns in the output of those models, which is sometimes a revelation that leads to the process of analytic thinking and discovery, that could be very valuable. It could also be valuable. People laugh when I say this, but I return to it over and over again. As codes become more complex, they become more prone to bugs. And finding them might be one of the great advances of machine learning. And that's not meant to be cynical.
What about the connection with social sciences?
Well, it's interesting that Tim, in his talk this morning, I think hit upon one of the things that interests me about that connection, because our field, amongst all the great, wonderful basic discoveries we've been talking about here, also has this amazing utility. And in some ways, the forecasting system has outpaced our ability to communicate people. And look what happened in Puerto Rico, for example, and Florida. And there is, a lot of potential in my mind for using probabilistic forecasting, for example, to do elementary things like preposition relief efforts. And there, that kind of massive data learning might come in handy as well.
Mike Wallace, student of Starr and Reggie Newell. When I think much of the emphasis in this conference with our heroes, Charney and Lorenz, was on their role in basic research, learning about the fundamentals of the way the atmosphere behaves. I remember not long after I graduated back in late 60s, the concern that maybe even a program like GARP, despite all the good things it was doing, was getting us a little too regimented. We had to work more in teams. I'm not questioning, but I believe it was a totally good thing. But carrying that forward to today, where the emphasis on teamwork, things like the contributions to the IPCC program are a much stronger part of our work. I wonder what you think of that. Are we going to do okay in preserving that emphasis on basic research?
I wish Maria Zuber was here. Maria Zuber is the vice president for research at MIT and formerly chair of EAPS. And she's also chair of the National Science Board, which oversees the National Science Foundation. And recently she had an editorial in the New York Times arguing for basic research. So on the National Science Board, we argue for basic research, that basic research is the engine of the economy. Basic research is what gives you the iPhone and the telephone and GPS and everything, the internet. That came not from targeted research, but from people, curiosity-driven research. So there's a led by Maria Zuber. I think there's a tremendous effort to argue to sustain basic research, curiosity-driven research, and I'll cheer her on.
I had a follow-up comment on that. I mean, one of the stories that I always liked to tell about Ed Lorenz was that he would tell me that he would often go over to the faculty club, which is where we had our dinner last night, and start playing chess, and then he would kind of wander back to his office several hours later. And one can't imagine doing that kind of thing today. They had time. They weren't running around like headless chickens, I don't think. And I wonder, they were also geniuses, right? And you can't kind of legislate for that. So I'm wondering whether the funding situation is that basically one has to fund one's research, rush around trying to raise resources. And it was pretty clear from our discussions yesterday that there were lots of funds coming in seemingly effortlessly in those days, and one perhaps had more time. I just wondered what people felt about that.
I think that I wish George Philander was here. George has talked about having a rich uncle that we didn't wish to acknowledge, which was the military. So a lot of the fundamental science that was funded in atmospherics, in meteorology, and in oceanography, because there was somebody, some entity out there that was interested in the findings. And so now it's much more, it's a totally different scenario for funding. And so I don't think we've got that rich uncle anymore. So anyway, so it's a totally different set of the totally different scene. So I don't think we can compare to what was then.
A few more quick questions. You and then Ray in the back. And then I have to get close, so please.
Okay. Peter Gilman, I got my PhD in the meteorology department in 1966. And this meeting has led me to try to reflect on why that particular department at that particular time, I think, was so successful in producing PhD graduates that fanned out all over the world, basically. And I would, particularly in atmospheric dynamics, I think there were two things that came. Obviously, we had four of the great dynamicists here in Charney, Lorenz, Starr, and Phillips. But if you think about the four of them, their personalities were all rather different. And I think, without even realizing it, the students there, including myself, had the opportunity to identify with a particular professor whom they might feel most compatible with. And I don't recall being assigned to any professor. The other thing is that I think the department, despite being a meteorology department, was quite open-minded about thesis topic, what you chose for a thesis topic. Certainly in my case, Victor Starr said, why don't you work on the sun? Well, nobody had worked on the sun in the meteorology department at MIT before that, as far as I know, and I turned it into a whole career. I think Norman Gaunt at one time was working on galaxies, and Bob Dickinson worked in that area. And it led me to reflect on the open-mindedness and the value of that in encouraging new and unusual research. And I was pleased by seeing some of the topics in this meeting and some of the faculty. For example, we heard on biological population dynamics from an associate professor of physics. Now, the title physics is a traditional title for a department, but surely biological population dynamics is not a traditional topic in a physics department, and I regard that as a huge plus. I'm just wondering, for the question for MIT is it, in some sense, institutional academic policy to encourage this kind of thing, to do unorthodox things in departments that might have traditional labels?
Absolutely, Peter. It is, I think it's one of the great advantages of MIT, and one of the reasons I personally am still here is they take that attitude. And if there has been one positive change since the era that we're all celebrating here, I would say that from direct experience, that the barriers between departments are much weaker now than they were back then. So we have students that go and work with physicists and biologists all over the department. And I think our particular department is awfully broad in that respect.
Right.
So that part of it's pretty healthy today.
Yeah.
But I think we have to recognize, as John said just now, if someone doing one of these interesting studies produced one paper every 5 years and they had 3 citations, they wouldn't do too well. And it is a problem. I mean, Eric Eady, John Green in the UK, and we heard that Ed Lorenz in his 63 paper had 3 citations in so many years, and publication rate just not good enough. And it is a problem, I think, that to allow people to really develop in an area and think something really new, the temptation to do something where you know you're going to get a result rather than go for that really interesting new direction. We were just discussing before, I can't remember, with Kerry, I don't know how Eric Eady got to what he did at all, but clearly he was off in a direction totally different from those around him, and the same was true with people here.
One of the things
I can make one little comment on that, because I completely agree with you, Kay, that MIT is very well set up to deal with these things, that the boundaries between groups, departments, even schools are very porous. And it's really a marvelous property of MIT. The other thing I really like about MIT, Professor Hoskins, is that when we are in Science Council, that's just a little anecdote I wanted to share with you, that if we discuss promotions or even salaries or tenure decisions, we never ever talk about the number of papers. We never ever talk about citations. It's all about impact. How has somebody made a difference? And I think MIT is, I wouldn't say unique, but it's not very common anymore these days, because it's so much easier to count citations and papers. But I'm very happy to say that we don't really do that.
If I could just make a final comment. I was thrilled when I learned that EAPS had gotten into the exosolar planet business, which has motivated me to give a significant amount of money to the department, which I had not been doing before. And I think it's that kind of reaching out to broad new horizons is crucial.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I will finish the questions, but please keep it brief. So we have 3 more to go. Ray is very patient. Thank you. Okay, 2 more questions.
My question was about the machine learning. So my name is Aditi Sheshadri. I was a student here a couple of years ago. I worked with Alan Plum, and now I started a faculty position at Stanford. So my question was about machine learning. Do you think that there's something to be learned from training these algorithms on observations or like high resolution models and then using that in full GCMs, such as for like convective parameterization and maybe gravity wave drag or something?
I think it would be arrogant of me to say, no, there's nothing new to be learned.
Yeah, I mean, I would second that. I don't know, I think maybe some of us who are yet to be my age have a romantic idea of the recent history of science that certainly I want to keep working and striving for basic understanding of things. And some of us think that will remain the key to major discoveries. And yet there is a legitimate demand in our field for just plain old practical innovation in things like NWP, and something like what you're talking about may aid that. It's less clear to me that's going to be a big boon to understanding, but I'm quite happy to be surprised by that.
But I would add that machine learning to me could open up new questions, but it wouldn't answer or explain. And you have to have that basic understanding to be able to explain the new phenomena. It's the same way of having a higher resolution microscope or having higher resolution or new instruments that we can observe.
Hi, I'm Joe.
The honor of the last question.
Yeah, well, this is going to sound irresponsible, but I think it's important. There are all kinds of pressures on people who are fundamentally academic, financial, social, and so forth. What can be done, in your opinion, to make life in science continue to be personally satisfying and fun, so that a career lasting 50 years doing science is seen as something really attractive and not a sacrifice?
Well, I'll go first. I think you probably all want to comment to that. And Joe, my own approach to that is probably something similar to what you might do, and that is to always convey to young people, I mean, right from K through 12 up, that science is wonderful, exciting, and fun, and the reason we're in it is to satisfy our curiosity. And it's not necessarily to accomplish some goal. If we can continue to train into the profession young people who are driven by curiosity, I have faith that it will continue to be seen as something wonderful and interesting to do. That's my own view of that. So the trick is, how do we make it keep portraying as exciting to young people?
And I think, Joe, what the 1.5 days here has shown, it's not just the intellectual curiosity and the satisfaction of chasing puzzles and solving puzzles, and the Earth is smarter than all of us, so there are endless puzzles to chase after, but it's also the intellectual companionship that we all share, that we are friends, and we're good friends, and we on the 14th floor get together for everybody's birthdays, and I know Kevin and his friends have a round robin. So it's that friendship, it's that intellectual companionship that we all, that keep us. That keep us together. There's a glue that is friendship, and this is family to me, that keep us here. That makes the difficult times easier to deal with.
I think with that, those beautiful words, Ines, I think it's a good... Or John, did you want to say?
Good.
You're good. Brian, you were in...
Well, to Joe, yes, communicating our enthusiasm is the first thing. I mean, I still think my latest paper is the best one I'm going to write. And if we can communicate that thrill of actually looking at something out there, and actually, I understand that better, and I think it's actually very valuable to society that I can do that. I mean, still turns me on, so I don't see why it shouldn't turn younger people on as well.
There are a million things that can make a
It's very true, and I think we can talk about this for a long time. And I would invite again everybody to join us for the special beer hour to continue conversations like this. But I would like to thank the panelists, Brian, Ines, Carrie, Alison, and John, for your contributions. I would like to thank all the speakers again. For the wonderful contributions today and also yesterday, I would say, yesterday afternoon and also after dinner. I would like to thank the audience for your attendance, your continued attendance. It's still very rich today, and also the audience and the questions. And also the audience that couldn't be here but followed us online. Thank you very much. By the way, this will be available. The whole session today will be available later on video, so you can, at your own leisure, you can follow it again. Of course, today was a tribute to two heroes of the field of atmospheric science. It was a tribute also to basic science. Brian, summarized very well the legacy in terms of the scientific accomplishments. Part of the legacy is also here in the audience. As Ernie Moniz said this morning, it's the biological family, but also the professional family that really, continues to benefit, including the young generation and the students. And that is a tremendous value that we should celebrate. Basic science is indeed very important. We've talked about it. I think we all agree. I think we all agree that it is, sometimes under threat. That funding is a problem, and there's all these issues that make science hard. It is incredibly important for us, of course, to continue that. And we talked about funding quite a bit, not long enough, but that's also entering my world. And I think everybody here and everybody who's listening in the audience who's not here, for all the contributions that you may have made in support of basic science. It's very important not only to fund the research, but also in particular, the students. It's so important, as Peter Gilman already said, in the academic freedom for students to come to MIT, which is so rich, the environment, so stimulating. And it would be such a shame if they are kind of curtailed in their interest and have to follow sponsored research. So it's very important for us to have fellowships so that students indeed, feel the freedom, to pursue their own interests, so that they can actually find their own supervisors. They often come here and they haven't, seen only a little bit for what they might be interested in. So if you have supported us, thank you very, very much. If you want to support us, let me know. We'll help you in your choices. The Lorenz Center, of course, is doing wonderful work in basic science, and they can really, use your support. There's actually a very nice project on, related to Charney, the Charney Library. It's a grassroots student effort to improve that library. So if you want to help out, that would be fantastic. So let me close today by thanking a few people. First of all, of course, again, the panelists and the speakers. I also want to like to, to thank a few people specifically, from EAPS who made this all work. There's many, many people, and always the risk when you start naming names, there's always the risk that you forget people, and I apologize in advance for doing so. But I would like to really single out John. You did a great job behind the screens, in front of the screens. It was really fantastic what you've done. Yeah. Carrie Emanuel, co-director of the Lorenz Center. Dan Rothman, another co-director of the Lorenz Center. Ralph Ferrari, who's the chair of the Program of Atmospheres, Oceans and Climate in the department. And Paolo Rizzoli, for all the wonderful contributions and the help, making this all work. So thank you very much. I want to acknowledge the financial support to make this work. Again, was shared between the Lorenz Center and the Houghton Funds. They basically provided the funds for everything you've enjoyed yesterday and today, and I thank you all very much for that. There's a large number of staff people, that have been working behind the screens, and without them, it's really impossible to do an event like this. I mean, they're largely invisible, but I would like to call out a few of them. Faith Zhang, Kurt Sternloff, you've seen him all day here. Jen Fentress, Lauren Hinkle, Angela Ellis, Helen Hill, John Castorf, Bill McKenna, Meg Rosenberg, and there's probably quite a few more that I forgot to mention, but I thank you very much for all your contributions. I mean, this has been fantastic. Finally, a huge and a very warm thanks for the family and the friends of Lorenz and Charney. It's been fantastic to meet some of you and to get to know some of you yesterday over dinner and through the many anecdotes. I think I've got a little bit of a better insight into the life and the work with these heroes because I didn't know them myself. I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure many in the audience have enjoyed it as well. So thank you very much for being here. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you join us also for the special peer hour. I mentioned already that the video will be available, and then let me just close by repeating my invitation to come to the Green Building again. It starts in 2 minutes, so we can all get there. The music doesn't start until 6:30, so we have plenty of time. Thank you for being here, well home, and please stay in touch with us. Thank you very much.